Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today and to share my research with you. It's really terrific to be in a room with people who are all interested in early childhood. So I'm really excited to share my work with you and get your thoughts on it as well. So I'm going to talk today about television viewing among infants, toddlers, and preschoolers and how it might relate to their executive function and their theory of mind. Before I get into the research itself, I thought I'd share a little bit of background with you, just to sort of set the context. So, television in young children. The American Academy of Pediatrics discourages media use in children under the age of 2, but these guidelines aren't really heard, right? Because we know that plenty of children watch television at very young ages. So just to give you some examples, 90% of 2-year-olds are watching television. About 75% of 4-month-olds are watching television, and about 50% of 2-month-olds are watching television. So children are pretty much from birth, they're exposed to television. Also, a lot of kids have televisions in their bedrooms. And that this used to be a phenomenon that was restricted to teenagers or older children, but what we're seeing increasingly is that parents are putting televisions in the bedrooms of their very young children. So just to give you some more statistics, in 2005, this is among parents of 6 to 21-month-olds, 19% had a television in their bedroom, and by 2011, 29% had a television in their bedroom. So these are very young kids with TVs in their bedrooms. So, why do we care about all of this? Well, there's been a lot of research on the effects of television on children, generally speaking, not as much on young children, that's sort of a growing area, but essentially what we know from the research that's been done is that the more that children watch television, the worse their academic outcomes tend to be, the worse their health outcomes tend to be, and also their social behavior tends to be impaired as well. So we tend to see less positive social behavior and more negative social behavior, so especially aggression. That's been something that's been focused on quite a bit. And when I started looking at these issues, I focused on social behavior as well. So the general idea, when we're thinking about the effects of television on children, in the literature, the basic idea is that the more children watch television, the more they behave in an aggressive way, kind of a direct effect. There's a lot of explanations available to try and account for this relationship. Things like social learning theory is used quite a bit, priming, cognitive script theory. All of these theories suggest that children take something from that content and then they then incorporate that into their everyday behaviors. So as I started looking at television in young children and wanting to get into this area, I figured, well, I need to learn a lot about young children and do a lot of reading in this area. So I started to do that, and with a focus on children's social behavior, and these two constructs kept coming up as being important. So these constructs are theory of mind and executive function. So I want to tell you a little bit about these constructs. You may be familiar with them. I know that in prior talks here, there's been some discussion of theory of mind, so I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but just to provide a little bit of an overview. So theory of mind is defined in this way. It's the awareness that mental states are unique, varied, and prone to error. And by mental states, what I'm talking about is children's desires, their beliefs, their emotions, their intentions, and essentially when children acquire a theory of mind, they can understand their peers a lot better. They can understand things like the distinction between a mistake and a lie. They can more successfully engage in certain forms of play, like hide and seek. They can perhaps understand that there's a connection between their feelings and their behavior, so it's an important advancement in their understanding of people. And so not surprisingly, the research suggests that when children acquire this theory of mind and when they have a more sophisticated theory of mind, they are able to have more successful social relationships and reduced aggression. And I thought this was interesting because so much media effects research focuses on these outcomes. So this seemed important. In terms of executive function can be defined this way: higher order processes that aid in planning and regulating behavior. Essentially, when we talk about executive function, we're talking about goal-directed, self-regulatory behaviors. It includes things like working memory, inhibitory control or impulse control, attention flexibility. And when children have more sophisticated or developed executive function skills, they can override any impulses that they have and choose a more appropriate social behavior. They can think about social situations in multiple ways. They can engage in pro-social behaviors like turn-taking, those kinds of things, and they're typically rewarded in both academic contexts and also in social contexts. So we see that, like theory of mind, executive function predicts successful social relationships and reduced aggression as well. So theory of mind and executive function are distinct concepts, but they're related to one another. They're both considered indicators of neuropsychological function. They reflect activity in the brain's prefrontal cortex. They undergo a period of rapid growth and change during the preschool years. So in studying children and television, I thought, well, these seem like really important concepts to incorporate into the work, especially when we're dealing with young children, like preschoolers. So I started to rethink this simple model here. And I started to wonder whether maybe the model should look something like this instead. In other words, maybe this connection between television viewing and aggression can be explained by children's theory of mind and their executive function. So in other words, maybe what happens is that the more children watch television, the more that their theory of mind and executive function skills are weakened, and that therefore can translate into more aggression. So there's some good reasons to expect that there would be this connection between television viewing and executive function and theory of mind, because the research that's been done in that area has shown that theory of mind and executive function are sensitive to the environment, right? So theory of mind and executive function develop sort of naturally on their own in typically developing children, but they are susceptible to things like parenting styles, household chaos, chronic noise. All these kinds of things can shape how theory of mind and executive function develop. So I was thinking that, well, why not television, right? Because television is such a dominant part of the environment for young children nowadays. So is it possible that repeated exposure to television could also influence children's neuropsychological function in a similar way? And if you think about how children watch television or the programs that they're watching and really what's required, when they watch television, it tends to be very fast-paced, right? There's a lot of scene changes, rapid cuts, bright colors, sounds, interesting visuals. There's just a lot going on. And it's almost like an attention-directing parent in a way, right? So the child watches television and they're not really so much in control of what they're paying attention to, but the TV is saying, look over here, listen to that, pay attention to this, on, maybe goes to a commercial break, suddenly they have to disengage from the content, re-engage in a commercial, which they might not really understand, go back to the content. So there's just it's pretty overwhelming, actually. So just like a parent could shape children's executive function, television viewing might be able to shape it too. Also, if you think about the kinds of characters that are portrayed on television, they tend to be pretty unidimensional. Characters on television, the emphasis tends to be on action rather than mental states. So perhaps when children watch a lot of TV, their theory of mind, they don't have that opportunity to develop their theory of mind. Maybe it even impairs it to some extent. So these are just some ideas for how television could be related to neuropsychological function. And so in the work that I'm going to talk about today, I wanted to focus on this connection here between TV viewing and theory of mind and executive function. Okay, so what I want to tell you about today are a few studies that I've conducted, and to set that up, I want to talk about television exposure, generally speaking, because if you're going to study television viewing, television viewing is just a very broad concept, and it could mean a lot of different things. So when you measure television viewing, you kind of have to conceptually think about a lot of different things at the same time, and I've tried to capture different forms of television viewing among children to really tease out what's going on in terms of its connection with executive function and theory of mind. So television exposure, what does that mean? Well, I think most of the time when you think about television exposure, the tendency is to think about how much TV are they watching, right? Just sort of total exposure. How many hours a day are children watching television? So in the work that I'm going to tell you about, we measured the number of hours that children are exposed to television. But you might suspect that, well, it makes a difference what they're watching, right? They could be spending all day watching PBS, or they could be spending all day watching some commercial programs, and that might have an influence. So thinking about television viewing, it's also important to consider the content that children are exposed to. So in the studies that I'm going to talk about today, we also looked at children's exposure to different genres of television, different channels. Even the kinds of channels that they watch can be indicative of what kind of content they're exposed to. And also, in some studies, in one study actually, the particular programs that kids are actually tuning into. Another issue is, where are children watching television? So in terms of measurement-wise, what that translated down to for us was, does the child have a television in their bedroom or not? TV and this concept has been measured in a lot of prior research, and there is research to show that kids who have TVs in their bedrooms tend to experience a host of worse outcomes compared to kids who don't have TVs in their bedrooms. So that's something we wanted to capture. And also, when did they start watching? When in their development did they start watching? Because you might expect that that would matter. Did they start watching when they were babies? In other words, were they first put in front of the set when they were babies? Did they not start watching until they were 4 years old or 5 years old? So in some of the studies here, we also assessed the age that children started watching television. And finally, there was one other form of exposure that we've measured in this work, and that is, are they watching? Are the kids themselves actually watching? And what I'm talking about here is their exposure to background television. Background TV is a concept that increasingly is gaining attention in the literature because we know that televisions are simply on in households for a lot of time. Background TV is just the presence of a TV, TV being on, regardless of whether anybody's watching it or not. And in some households, the TV is just simply on all day long. So the question is, does that exposure to just that background television influence children's neuropsychological function? Okay, so this is sort of the framework, the setup to talk about two different projects. And 4 different papers. The first 2 focus on theory of mind. One of my co-authors, Patrick Fries, is actually here today in the back. So talk about some work that we did. And another paper that looked at executive function. These first 3, they're all from the same project. And they're all research done with preschoolers. And then the last study, the second project that I want to tell you about, also with Patrick, is a study on infants. Same kinds of issues, but looking at a younger population. Okay, so starting then with this topic, television, theory of mind, and preschoolers. 2 papers here that I want to tell you about. So the first one was a study that we did. It involved a little over 100 parents and preschoolers. Parents completed a questionnaire where they reported on their children's television viewing. So the indicators that I talked about earlier, all of those things were assessed in the questionnaire. They they reported other information too, demographics, that kind of thing too. But then we also did interviews with the preschoolers themselves, one-on-one interviews. We assessed their vocabulary, because that's an important control variable, and we also assessed their theory of mind. And the way that we did that, I thought I'd just share with you a little bit without going into too much detail or taking too much time. Children completed 6 different tasks to get at their theory of mind. And the tasks assessed a number of different components of theory of mind. Diverse desires, this is understanding of diverse desires, diverse beliefs, knowledge access, contents false belief, explicit false belief, belief emotion. So, and so just to sort of explain a little bit more, give you sort of a taste of what we did. So talking about the diverse the diverse beliefs measure, and that is, this was the prop here that we used, and also these little toy figurines we used with all the tasks too. So we showed children this laminated picture that had a picture of a set of bushes and also a garage. And we showed this to them, and then we said, well, you know, here's Polly, and Polly lost her cat. And her cat might be hiding in the bushes, or it might be in the garage. Where do you think the cat is? And the child would pick one of the 2. And we'd say, well, that's a good idea. But Polly, so let's say the child said, well, I think the cat's in the bushes. And so, well, that's a good idea, but Polly thinks the cat is in the garage. So where will Polly look for her cat? So children were considered to have passed this task if the answer that they chose was opposite of what they said, okay? So it reflects this understanding that I think this, but she thinks something different, and she's going to look in a different location based on her different belief, okay? Just one other example here. So this is the contents false belief. This is with the Band-Aids and the pig. So we showed the children this Band-Aids box and asked them, well, what do you think's in the Band-Aids box? Band-Aids, they said, well, let's take a look inside. And they opened it up, and they found that there was this little plastic pig inside. Oh, there's a pig inside instead. Put it back in, cover it up. And we asked them, you know, what was in the Band-Aids box again? A pig. You know, they remembered that the pig was in there. So then we said, well, here comes Johnny, right? Johnny's never seen inside this Band-Aid box before. What does he think is in the box? Does he think there are Band-Aids, or does he think there's a pig? And then we would ask them, did Johnny ever see inside the Band-Aids box before? So they would be considered to have passed that task if they said, first of all, no, Johnny had not seen inside the box before, and Johnny thinks that there are Band-Aids in the box. So it reflects the understanding that, you know, that even though I know there's a pig inside that box, someone else who's never seen it before would think that there's Band-Aids in it, right? So we assessed theory of mind through these activities here and summed across them, so we got an overall score for theory of mind. And then we looked at the relationship between the parent reports of their children's television exposure and how well they did on the theory of mind assessment. So, and here's what we found. I've highlighted a couple of results here. So we found that the more that kids were exposed to background television in the home, the worse they did on the theory of mind assessment. We also found that children who had a television in their bedroom also performed worse on the theory of mind assessment. Okay. So what about content, right? I talked before that content could make a difference. Well, we looked at their exposure to a lot of different types of content and didn't find a whole lot, but there were two findings that we did have. I'm hesitant to make too much of them because they're just these two kind of stray findings, but interestingly, we found that the more that children were watching ABC Family, the network, the better they did on theory of mind. So I'm not sure what to make of that. I'd like to see that replicated, but, well, let me show you the other finding and then I'll sort of talk about why I think that might be. The other thing, which was also surprising, was that the more that they were watching educational cartoons, things like Dora, the worse they did on the theory of mind assessment, which is not consistent with other research. Well, some other research it is consistent with, but generally speaking, educational cartoons are considered to be positive. In terms of ABC Family, well, ABC Family, if you're familiar with that network, they show a lot of movies. They show programs that have human characters. They're not cartoons. And the kinds of dilemmas and situations that they get into have to do with, sort of interpersonal dilemmas. And maybe children can get something in terms of mental states from watching that. It's hard to believe that preschoolers really could, but maybe. With educational cartoons, it's an interesting finding. Perhaps parents who let their kids watch a lot of educational cartoons sort of feel like, well, my kids are in good hands watching these programs. They're high quality, and therefore they don't interact with their children as much. Maybe that's the explanation. That's another one that I think we'd want to replicate before making too much of. But, so talking more generally about the other findings concerning background TV and TV in the bedroom, we found that it was related to worse performance on the theory of mind assessment. Why would that be? Well, it could be because background TV and bedroom TV, maybe these are measures of just parents who are, households in which parents are less engaged with their kids. The TV's on all the time, so maybe parents aren't interacting as much with their kids. Maybe, the kids watch TV in their bedroom a lot, and so they're not interacting with their parents. Maybe that's the explanation. But I started to wonder, what could be some other explanations? And so we thought, well, what about sleep? Could this be playing a role here? Because if you look at background TV and bedroom TV, these measures are not necessarily indicators of children's actual viewing, but they are indicators of exposure. In other words, the TV is on in the household, presumably the TV is on in the bedroom, and perhaps this sort of constant or continual exposure to just a television that's on interferes with the brain's sleep regulation system. We know that from prior work that these self-luminous electronic screens like televisions or computers and tablets, that they emit short wavelength blue light, and that blue light suppresses melatonin secretion in the brain and interferes with sleep quality. So maybe that's what's going on here. And of course, sleep quality is really important for cognitive function. So perhaps that's the mediator. So the study I did with Patrick, we looked at this model and we thought, well, maybe what's happening is television exposure is leading to less sleep, and less sleep in turn is related to worse performance on theory of mind. So we looked at this. We focused on background television, we focused on bedroom television, and we also focused on how much children were watching television in the evening, because we would think that would have the strongest relationship with impaired sleep. And what we found, I know this is small and hard to see exactly, but just to highlight a couple things here. This model here shows us that sleep time was a significant mediator of the relationship between background TV exposure and theory of mind. So that relationship there is significant and it's negative. And what it tells us is that the more that kids were exposed to background TV, the less they were sleeping at night. And the less that they were sleeping at night, the worse they did on theory of mind. That's also a significant relationship there. Okay, did not find evidence for this with bedroom TV. Bedroom TV, the presence of a TV in the bedroom surprisingly was not related to children's sleep. So I don't know what to make of that, but in terms of nighttime television viewing, we found a similar mediation pattern here with the more that kids were watching television in the evening hours, the less sleep they were getting, and the less sleep they were getting, the worse they did on that theory of mind assessment that we gave them. Okay, so some conclusions here from these first couple of studies. So television exposure, some forms anyway, do seem to be related to worse performance on theory of mind assessments. We found some evidence that may be because of impaired sleep. Still, could be that these are symptoms of less engaged parents, and maybe that's responsible for that link. Maybe it's the fact that they're exposed to chronic noise in the household. So these are just some things to follow up with future work. So I want to tell you next about the third paper that came out of this project, and that was focused on television viewing, executive function, and preschoolers. So it's the same study, so same design, same materials, but we also assessed the children's executive function with 4 different tasks in addition to the theory of mind. And these were the tasks here: grass, snow, whisper, backward digit span, tower. I can tell you more about them if you're interested, but I did want to just highlight the grass, snow task because I think that one is a really good representation of this. That's the grass, snow task. We used this to assess that, and we presented children with this black poster board with these 2 hands, 2 felt cutouts of hands on it, and then at the top were these cardboard cutouts that were either a white square or a green square. And we asked kids first, what's the color of grass? They would say green. What's the color of snow? They would say white. So they knew that. We'd say, well, in this silly game, we want you to put your hands on these little hand shapes here. And when I say grass, I want you to point to the white square. And when I say snow, I want you to point to the green square. And then we did it 16 times in a row pretty quickly. So this is tough, right? This is something you could try yourself sometime and see how good you do. It's challenging, but it requires kids to keep this rule in mind, to override their impulse when they hear grass to point to the green card, and to be constantly sort of shifting their cognitive perspective. So it's a challenging task. But it's a good representation of a theory of mind assessment. So just want to highlight a few things here in the results. Okay. Some of the big findings or major findings here were that we found that the onset of television viewing was positively related to children's performance on those executive function tasks. So that's what's being shown here. So what that means is that the later that children started watching television, the older they were, the better they did. So the earlier they started watching television, the worse they did on the executive function tasks. And we also found that children's overall time spent watching television was negatively related to their performance on the executive function tasks. So the more they were watching TV, the more time they spent, the worse they did. Okay, a couple other things. I know these are tiny here. I'll just talk you through the findings. Just a couple of things to point out here. I'll start with this one. This is looking at content. Children's exposure, the more that they were watching PBS, the better they did on the executive function tasks. And once again, with educational cartoons, we found a negative relationship. So the more they were watching educational cartoons, things like Dora, those kinds of things, the worse they did on the executive function tasks. Okay, so what are some conclusions from this study? Well, it seems as though total TV time is negatively related to children's executive function. And again, this could be because when children are spending a lot of time watching television, they're constantly in sort of this reactive processing state where the television is sort of directing their attention to various elements, and they're constantly engaging and disengaging with the material, and that maybe with enough exposure to that, it compromises their executive function skills. Viewing at young ages was also a problem in terms of executive function skills as well. So it could be that kids who start watching when they're infants, they experience worse outcomes compared with if they start watching when they're older, during the preschool age. And high quality non-commercial television, PBS, may benefit executive function, and that finding is generally consistent with some other research on positive effects of PBS. Okay, so last study I want to tell you about is this project that looked at television theory of mind, executive function, but among younger children. And the question here is, would we see these same results when we looked at a population of infants? Now this was a first attempt to look at these kinds of issues, so we didn't study infants for this particular study. We did a survey of mothers, a national survey of mothers, and they reported on their children to see whether there would be anything going on here. So we had the moms report on their children's television exposure, various forms like I've talked about before. And then the moms also reported on their children's theory of mind and executive function. So now when we're talking about younger kids, these, especially for theory of mind, it's a different kind of concept, right? So for theory of mind, although that's really believed to develop during the preschool years, there are some behaviors that are considered indicative of theory of mind, even during infancy. And one of them is infants' declarative pointing behaviors. So declarative pointing is when a child points not to request something, but to establish joint attention with the parent or whoever they're with. So essentially, it's the child, let's say a child hears an unusual sound and points in the direction of the unusual sound. The idea is that the infant is sort of signaling to the caregiver, hey, I heard something interesting. I don't know if you did. Look over there, let's sort of figure this out. So in a way, it reflects this awareness of diverse perspectives and an interest in merging two different perspectives together. So declarative pointing is something that we measured. We had parents report on how often their kids were engaging in these declarative pointing behaviors. And for executive function, parents completed part of the early childhood behavior questionnaire, which assesses children's effortful control, things like their impulse control, impulsivity, those kinds of things. Okay, so what did we find? Well, we did find that there were some relationships between children's television exposure and their executive function. But maternal employment was important, and it was really tough to even think about these relationships without factoring in maternal employment, which was interesting. We found that the effects were influenced by and also varied according to whether the moms were working outside of the home or not. So here's one finding here where maternal employment had an indirect effect on children's executive function difficulty, and that operated through their exposure to commercial television viewing, the children's commercial TV viewing. So in other words, what we found was that moms who worked outside of the home had kids, infants, who were watching more commercial TV, so non-PBS programs, and exposure to this commercial television viewing was related to more trouble with executive function. Okay, so So that was one thing we found, and then in addition, we found several instances of moderation where the relation between television exposure and children's executive function differed depending on whether their moms were working outside of the house or not. So I'll show you some examples of this. Okay, so these are 3 graphs here. They're all showing the same pattern. So these are interactions between maternal employment and infants' exposure, television exposure, on infants' executive function difficulty. So it's important to keep in mind that high scores here mean a problem with executive function, okay? So each of these graphs here, they're just different indicators of television viewing. This is overall television viewing time. This graph is commercial television viewing time. And this graph here is their exposure to baby TV, you know, baby DVDs, networks aimed at babies, that kind of content. And the red lines show the lines for infants of moms who were not working outside of the home. And what you can see is that these lines are pretty flat. There's not a whole lot going on there, which suggests that for infants whose mothers are not working, there really wasn't a relationship between their exposure to television and their executive function. But for infants whose mothers were working, and those are the blue lines here, what we see is that the more that they're exposed to the content, or the more time they're spending with television, the worse they're doing in terms of executive function. So that was an interesting finding to us. That was also, Patrick is co-author on that paper. So how do we make sense out of this? Well, it does seem that there's some evidence that television viewing is related to executive function among infants, but it's hard to talk about those relationships without factoring in whether the moms were working or not. Why would that be? Well, really need to follow that up to figure out why that could be. Perhaps what happens is when moms are working outside of the home, the infants are experiencing, and they're watching a lot of television, they're getting a lot of sort of the suboptimal stimulation from television, and at the same time, they're experiencing less time with their primary attachment figure. And maybe that combination makes them more susceptible to problems with executive function. Now, I think the reverse causation explanation is really compelling too, though, and I think it's important to consider. It could be, these are correlational data, so we don't know what's causing what, but it could be that when moms are working outside of the home and they have a child with executive function problems, in other words, a child who is impulsive, a child who has a short attention span, when moms get home at the end of the day and they have a lot of stuff to do and their child's getting into a lot of mischief or a lot of trouble, they may be more tempted to put that child in front of the TV to keep the child still, right? So they can get things done around the house. So that might be going on too. Okay, so just to wrap up, overall conclusions. So from this research, what we've found is that in terms of theory of mind, television exposure seems to have a generally negative effect. Background television, viewing at night, TV in the bedroom, they're all related to worse performance on theory of mind assessments. We found that in the case of background TV and viewing at night, that might be due to children's impaired sleep. When it comes to executive function, there also seems to be some negative relationships here in terms of total time viewing, and also viewing at a younger age seems to compromise executive function. PBS stands out as being something that is a positive influence on executive function, however. In terms of future work, I think there's a lot that needs to be done to follow up on this. We do need longitudinal research because all of the work I told you about is cross-sectional correlational data. And so we need to know what causes what. Also, we need to start thinking about maternal employment, especially when we're looking at studies with younger children, with infants. I did, after this finding with the infants, I went back and reanalyzed the data with the preschoolers to see if I could replicate those kinds of patterns with maternal employment, but that wasn't the case. So it could be that maternal employment really makes some difference when we're talking about younger kids. But that's something certainly to consider and to follow up on. And finally, it's important to measure and account for parent-child communication, because a lot of these findings also could be due to the fact that maybe when the TV's on a lot, parents are less engaged with their kids, and maybe that's what's accounting for some of these relationships. Okay, so thank you so much for your attention and interest in this topic. I'd like to acknowledge a number of people and places, so the School of Communication, who provided some funding to me to do this research, the participating daycare centers, including the Schoenbaum Center. They participated in the study on preschoolers. Also the graduate students, Patrick Fries, who's here, Dashina Alade, Eric Rasmussen, Molly Sharp, Kate Christie. And also, if you have any further questions that extend beyond this session, or you're interested in any of the copies of the research, I know some of them are here already, but please feel free to email me. I'd be happy to take any questions or requests that you have. So thank you very much.